A villa in Arcetri, whispers of confinement. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping through the heavy wooden doors of a villa perched on the hills outside Florence. The year is 1633, and the man crossing this threshold carries with him the weight of having glimpsed the very mechanics of heaven itself, only to be told by earthly powers that such glimpses are forbidden. The sound of his footsteps echoes against stone walls that will become both sanctuary and prison. Galileo Galilei, now 69 years old, sets down his few permitted belongings and listens to the silence that follows. Outside, the Tuscan countryside hums with late spring. The distant bleating of sheep, the rustle of olive groves in the afternoon breeze, the gentle murmur of voices from the nearby convent of San Matteo. But inside this villa in Arcetri, there is only the profound quiet that comes when a life of constant motion suddenly, irrevocably stops. Perhaps you know something of that wait, the moment when the momentum that has carried you forward for so long meets an immovable force. When the trajectory you've plotted for your life encounters a barrier you never saw coming. When you realize that the very thing you believed was your greatest strength has become, in the eyes of others, your most dangerous flaw. Galileo moves slowly through rooms that smell of dust and abandonment. The villa has been empty for months, waiting for its reluctant occupant. Shafts of golden light slant through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that dance and swirl, tiny particles following laws of motion that he has spent decades trying to understand. Even here, even now, the universe continues its ancient dance, indifferent to human judgment. The trial is over. The words still ring in his ears, vehemently suspect of heresy. The choice they offered him was no choice at all. Recant your life's work or burn for it. And so, kneeling before the 10 cardinals of the Inquisition, he had spoken the words they demanded. I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies. The greatest scientific mind of his age, reduced to theatre, playing the part of the penitent heretic. But even as his lips formed those words of surrender, legend tells us he whispered something else under his breath. Eppur si muove. And yet it moves. The earth, despite all their proclamations and threats and certainties, continues its eternal journey around the sun. You understand this tension, don't you? The space between what you know to be true and what the world demands you say. The weight of carrying knowledge that others aren't ready to accept. The loneliness of seeing clearly when those around you insist on looking away. The villa in Arcetri is modest by the standards of Medici Florence, but it is comfortable enough. 2 stories of weathered stone with a small garden where herbs grow wild and grapevines climb wooden trellises. From the upper windows, Galileo can see the dome of Florence's cathedral in the distance, and closer, much closer, the bell tower of the convent of San Matteo, where his daughter has taken the name Sister Maria Celeste. Virginia Maria Celeste. She was born when Galileo was young and the world seemed full of infinite possibility. Before the telescopes, before the discoveries that would change everything. He had placed her in the convent when she was 13, as was common for daughters of men who lived by their wits rather than their inheritance. But she had thrived there, becoming not just a nun, but a scholar in her own right, a correspondent who understood his work better than most of his colleagues. The proximity is both blessing and torment. She is so close, he can sometimes hear the convent bells that mark her days. Matins at dawn, vespers at sunset. Yet she might as well be on one of Jupiter's moons for all the freedom they have to simply be father and daughter. The rules of her order are strict. His house arrest, stricter still. As evening settles over the Tuscan hills, Galileo finds himself at a window, watching shadows lengthen across the valley below. The irony is not lost on him. The man who first turned a telescope toward the heavens, who mapped the craters of the moon and discovered the moons of Jupiter, who watched Venus wax and wane like a tiny moon. This man is now forbidden to travel more than a few hundred yards from where he stands. The weight of isolation begins to settle around him like a heavy cloak. For decades, his life has been one of constant motion, traveling between courts, demonstrating his latest invention, engaging in heated debates with philosophers and mathematicians. His mind has ranged across the cosmos, but his days have been filled with human contact, with the electricity of ideas shared and challenged. Now, silence. the kind of profound quiet that forces a person to confront not just what they've lost, but who they are when stripped of all the external validation and stimulation that once defined them. Perhaps you felt echoes of this in your own life, moments when the constant demands and interactions suddenly cease, leaving you alone with thoughts that seem too large for the space that contains them, when the very qualities that drive your success, the restless curiosity, the refusal to accept conventional wisdom, the need to push boundaries, become sources of isolation rather than connection. From his window, Galileo can see lights beginning to flicker in farmhouses scattered across the hillsides. Families gathering for their evening meal, children being called in from their play, the simple rhythms of ordinary life continuing as they have for centuries. There is something both comforting and heartbreaking in this view, the reminder that the world continues, that most people live their entire lives without ever wondering whether the earth moves around the sun or the sun around the earth. Is there peace in such simplicity? He wonders this as he watches smoke rise from distant chimneys. Is there a kind of freedom in accepting the boundaries others set for your thoughts, your questions, your reach toward understanding? But even as the question forms, he knows the answer. For him, there can be no unknowing what he has seen through his telescope. No way to unsee the mountains on the moon, the phases of Venus, the dance of Jupiter's satellites. The universe has revealed its secrets to him, and that revelation has become part of who he is, as fundamental as breath or heartbeat. The first night in Arcetri passes slowly. The bed is unfamiliar, the sounds different from those he's grown accustomed to in Rome, in Florence, in all the places where he once moved freely. But gradually he begins to notice something unexpected, a quality of attention that emerges only in stillness. Without the constant pressure of lectures to prepare, demonstrations to arrange, critics to answer, his mind begins to settle into a different rhythm, deeper, more patient. The thoughts that come are less reactive, less driven by the need to prove or persuade. They arise from some quieter place, like water from a well that has finally been allowed to clear. This is what confinement teaches, if we let it. That sometimes our greatest insights come not when we're rushing toward the next discovery, but when we're forced to sit quietly with what we already know. When the external world shrinks, the internal world has space to expand. In the morning, he wakes to the sound of bells from Maria Celeste's convent, the call to lauds, the morning prayer. Through his window, he can see the building where she kneels with her sisters, beginning another day of structured devotion. There is something both painful and beautiful in this shared rhythm. Father and daughter, both confined by forces larger than themselves, both finding ways to continue their work within the boundaries imposed upon them. He thinks of the letter she sent him during the trial. I am always thinking of you and feeling infinite concern for your health and for the resolution of your affairs. I pass the nights without sleeping and the days without any peace. Her love has been one of the few constants as his world has shifted and narrowed. Now, at least, they share the same horizon. The weight you carry tonight, the pressure of building something meaningful while navigating forces that seem determined to constrain or diminish what you're trying to create. Galileo knew this weight. In his villa in Arcetri, surrounded by the beauty of Tuscany but cut off from the wider world where his ideas might flourish, he faced the fundamental question that confronts every person who dares to see beyond the accepted boundaries of their time. How do you continue when continuation seems impossible? How do you build when the very foundations you've laid are declared unstable? How do you hold on to truth when the cost of that truth appears to be everything you've worked for? The answers, if they come at all, emerge slowly, like dawn breaking over the hills outside his window, revealing a landscape that was always there, waiting to be seen in new light. The confines of knowledge, Galileo's study. And so he climbs the narrow stone steps to his study each morning, as he has done for months now. The familiar creak of the third step, the way the morning light filters through the single window, casting long shadows across the room that has become both his laboratory and his prison. The study is not large, perhaps 15 feet square, with walls lined floor to ceiling with books that smell of leather and time. Volumes of Aristotle and Archimedes, Copernicus and Kepler, their spines worn smooth by countless hands seeking answers to questions that seem to multiply rather than diminish with each discovery. The scent is particular to places where knowledge accumulates. That mixture of parchment and ink, of candle wax and the faint mustiness that comes when ideas are left to ferment in stillness. You know this feeling, don't you? The weight of accumulated knowledge that sits heavily on your shoulders, not the burden of ignorance, but something far more complex. The responsibility that comes with seeing clearly when others prefer the comfort of familiar shadows. The exhaustion that follows when you've spent years building something that challenges the accepted order, only to find yourself confined by the very system you sought to illuminate. Galileo's desk sits beneath the window, positioned to catch the best light. It's a simple piece, really. Oak darkened with age, its surface scarred by years of calculation and contemplation. Here lie his manuscripts, some finished, others abandoned mid-sentence when the weight of their implications became too heavy to bear. The pages are covered in his careful script, mathematical notations dancing alongside sketches of celestial bodies, Jupiter's moons traced in delicate arcs, the phases of Venus documented with the precision of someone who has looked long and hard at truths others refuse to see. His fingers trace these drawings now, as they do each morning, a ritual of remembrance and defiance. The telescope that revealed these wonders sits nearby, its brass fittings tarnished, but still functional, still capable of showing anyone willing to look that the universe is far stranger and more beautiful than the authorities would have us believe. But who is there to look now? Who is there to share these discoveries with, when sharing itself has become an act of rebellion? The silence in the study is profound, not the empty quiet of abandonment, but the dense stillness that comes when a brilliant mind is forced to turn inward. It's the silence you know well, isn't it? Those moments when the world has told you to stop, to reconsider, to perhaps choose a safer path, and you find yourself alone with the weight of what you know to be true, wondering whether the cost of truth is worth the isolation it brings. On the shelf nearest his desk sits a letter, creased from repeated reading. It's from Maria Celeste, written in her careful convent script, and it speaks of practical matters, the household accounts, the garden that needs tending, the small concerns of daily life that continue even when the larger world seems to have stopped making sense. But between the lines, there's something else. A daughter's love for a father whose brilliance has brought him both fame and suffering in equal measure. She visits when she can. This daughter who chose the contemplative life long before her father's confinement made contemplation a necessity rather than a choice. She brings news from beyond these walls, manages the correspondence that still trickles in from fellow scholars across Europe, and provides the kind of steady presence that allows a restless mind to find moments of peace. You understand this need, don't you? The way isolation can sharpen both insight and anxiety. How the absence of daily distractions can reveal truths about yourself and your work that you might prefer to avoid. The founder's paradox, that the very solitude necessary for deep thinking can become a prison when it's imposed rather than chosen. Galileo arranges his papers with the methodical care of someone who has learned that order in small things can provide anchor points when larger certainties have been stripped away. Here, a treatise on motion that challenges everything Aristotle taught about the physical world. There, observations of the moon's surface that reveal it to be not a perfect celestial sphere, but a world of mountains and valleys much like our own. And here, most dangerous of all, calculations that support the Copernican model. The heretical notion that we are not the center of all creation, but passengers on a small world orbiting an unremarkable star. The irony is not lost on him, that in being forced into this small room, his understanding of the vast universe has only deepened. Confinement has a way of focusing the mind, doesn't it? When the external world contracts, the internal landscape often expands, revealing territories of thought and feeling that the busyness of normal life keeps hidden. He picks up his pen, dips it carefully in the inkwell, and begins to write. Not about the movements of planets today. That particular battle has been fought and, at least publicly, lost. Instead, he writes about motion itself, about the way objects fall and pendulums swing, about the mathematical principles that govern the physical world, regardless of what any tribunal might decree about their theological implications. This is his rebellion now. Quiet, methodical, disguised as pure mathematics. If he cannot speak openly about the cosmos, he can at least explore the laws that govern earthly motion. If he cannot teach that the earth moves around the sun, he can at least investigate how objects move upon the earth. It's a compromise that tastes bitter in his mouth, but it's also a form of resistance, the scholar's insistence that truth once glimpsed cannot be entirely suppressed. The morning light shifts as clouds pass overhead, casting the study in alternating brightness and shadow. It's a reminder of the larger world beyond these walls. The world where his former students continue their studies, where his books are read in secret, where the ideas he championed slowly, quietly, inevitably take root despite official disapproval. You know this feeling too, don't you? The strange comfort that comes from working in the shadows, from building something important without fanfare, from trusting that good work will find its way into the world, even when the world seems determined to resist it. There's a particular kind of strength required for this. Not the bold courage of public confrontation, but the patient endurance of the gardener who plants seeds, knowing they may not see the full harvest. On the windowsill sits a small brass astrolabe, its intricate markings catching what light penetrates the morning clouds. It's a navigation instrument, designed to help sailors find their way across vast oceans by reading the positions of the stars. How fitting that it should rest here, in this room where a different kind of navigation takes place. The careful plotting of a course through intellectual territory that has been declared forbidden. The weight you carry is not so different, is it? The responsibility of seeing clearly when others prefer comfortable illusions, of building something that challenges accepted wisdom, of continuing forward when the path ahead seems blocked by forces beyond your control. The burden of leadership, whether in science or commerce or any field where progress depends on someone willing to question what everyone else accepts as unchangeable truth. Galileo sets down his pen and looks out the window toward the convent where Maria Celeste spends her days in prayer and contemplation. From here, he can just see the bell tower that marks the hours of her ordered life. A life that has found peace in submission to divine will, while his own has been shaped by the irresistible urge to question and discover. Perhaps there's wisdom in both approaches, the mystic's surrender and the scientist's stubborn curiosity. Perhaps the real challenge is not choosing between them, but finding a way to honor both. To maintain the questioning spirit that drives all genuine discovery, while accepting that some battles cannot be won through argument alone, but only through the patient accumulation of evidence that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. The study grows quiet again as he returns to his writing. The soft scratch of pen on parchment, the distant sound of church bells marking another hour, passed in this strange exile that is both punishment and unexpected gift. For here, in this small room, with its weight of books and memories and half-finished manuscripts, the real work continues. Not the public demonstrations and dramatic debates of his younger years, but the deeper, quieter labor of understanding that requires no audience beyond truth itself. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps it has to be enough. The knowledge that somewhere, in studies like this one, minds continue to push against the boundaries of the known world, that the questions you're afraid to ask out loud are being explored by others who share your restless curiosity, that the work of building a truer, more complete understanding of reality continues even when that work must be done in whispers and shadows. The morning light settles into the steady glow of midday, and Galileo writes on. Each word, a small act of defiance, each calculation a quiet insistence that truth, once glimpsed, cannot be entirely contained by any earthly authority. In this small room, the universe continues to expand, and the daughter's devotion, Sister Maria Celeste. But Galileo does not work alone in this strange exile, though the walls of his villa might suggest otherwise. Less than a mile away, in the convent of San Matteo, another mind turns toward his welfare with the devotion that only love can sustain. Sister Maria Celeste, born Virginia Galilei, has chosen a life of prayer and service, yet her heart remains forever tethered to the man who taught her to see wonder in the movement of the stars. You know this feeling, perhaps, the way certain relationships transcend physical distance, how love finds channels that no authority can entirely block. In your own work, in what you're building, there are surely those whose support flows toward you even when you cannot see them, whose concern for your well-being operates like a constant, gentle current beneath the surface of your days. Maria Celeste rises before dawn, as she has for 17 years since taking her vows. The convent bells mark the rhythm of her life, just as surely as your phone marks the rhythm of yours. Yet within this structure, she has carved out space for something that no religious order anticipated. She has become her father's lifeline to the world beyond his villa walls. In the pale light filtering through her cell window, she sits at a small wooden table, quill in hand, composing another letter. Her handwriting flows with the practiced elegance of someone who has made correspondence an art form. Each word chosen not just for its meaning, but for its capacity to carry comfort across the short distance that might as well be an ocean. "Most beloved Lord Father," she writes, as she always begins. The formality masks an intimacy that runs deeper than blood, the connection between two minds that have learned to find solace in each other's thoughts. She asks about his health, his work, his spirits. She shares small observations from the convent garden, the way the morning light catches the olive leaves, how the herbs are growing, which sisters have been asking after him. But these letters carry more than sentiment. Hidden within the gentle inquiries and domestic details, Maria Celeste weaves practical assistance that keeps her father's world functioning. She has become his secretary, his agent, his bridge to a society that has officially turned away from him. When he needs books, she finds ways to acquire them. When he requires materials for his experiments, she locates sympathetic merchants. When his health falters, she sends remedies prepared with her own hands. You understand this kind of support, don't you? The way the weight you carry becomes lighter when someone else truly sees what you're attempting to build. Not the public version, not the simplified story you tell at networking events, but the full complexity of what drives you forward despite the obstacles. The convent garden where Maria Celeste spends her afternoons has become, in many ways, a reflection of her care for her father. She tends each plant with the same meticulous attention she brings to his needs, understanding that growth requires patience, that the most beautiful flowers often bloom in the most challenging conditions. Her hands move among the herbs with practiced gentleness. Rosemary for memory, lavender for peace, chamomile for sleep. These are not merely plants to her, but living prayers, each one cultivated with the hope that its essence might somehow reach across the distance to ease her father's suffering. She dries the herbs carefully, packages them with notes about their preparation, sends them along with her letters. The other sisters have learned not to question this devotion. They see how Maria Celeste's face brightens when a message arrives from the villa, how she carries herself with quiet purpose as she prepares her responses. Some might call it worldly attachment, a distraction from spiritual pursuits. But the abbess, a woman of uncommon wisdom, recognizes something deeper at work. Love, she once observed to Maria Celeste, is not diminished by being directed toward earthly relationships when it serves to ease suffering and support truth. Your care for your father is itself a form of prayer. And indeed, there is something sacred in the way Maria Celeste has transformed her concern into action. She has learned to read between the lines of Galileo's letters, to detect when his spirits are low, when his health is declining, when the isolation weighs most heavily upon him. Her responses arrive with the reliability of sunrise, carrying not just words, but the steady assurance that he is not forgotten. When Galileo's arthritis flares, making it difficult for him to write, Maria Celeste becomes his hands. She copies his manuscripts, transcribes his thoughts, ensures that his work continues to flow even when his body rebels. When his eyes grow weak from years of peering through telescopes and microscopes, she describes the world beyond the convent walls with such vivid detail that he can almost see it himself. The pear trees are heavy with fruit, she writes in one letter. The weight of their abundance makes the branches bow toward the earth, as if the trees themselves were offering thanksgiving for the season's generosity. I think of how knowledge, too, becomes heavy when it is ripe, how the mind that carries great understanding must sometimes bend under its weight. You know this weight, don't you? The way insight and responsibility can accumulate until they reshape the very posture of your days. But you also know, as Maria Celeste understands, that this weight can be shared, that the burden becomes bearable when others help carry not just the practical load, but the emotional complexity of what you're attempting to accomplish. Yet this devotion comes at a cost that Maria Celeste bears with characteristic silence. The stress of her father's situation, the constant worry about his health and safety, the delicate work of maintaining his connections to the outside world, All of this takes its toll on her own well-being. Those who observe her closely notice the subtle changes. Her step is less certain than it once was. Her appetite diminishes. The bright energy that once made her the heart of the convent's daily life begins to flicker like a candle burning too close to its base. She does not complain, would not dream of adding her own concerns to the weight her father already carries. But in the quiet moments between prayers, when she thinks no one is watching, exhaustion settles over her features like a shadow. She has poured so much of herself into sustaining him that little remains for her own nourishment. The other sisters begin to worry. They see how Maria Celeste pushes herself through days that would challenge someone half her age, how she rises earlier and retires later, always finding one more task that might ease her father's burden. They recognize the signs of someone who has made another's well-being more important than her own survival. But perhaps this is what love looks like when it encounters impossible circumstances. Not the grand gestures that make for easy stories, but the daily choice to extend oneself beyond reasonable limits because the alternative, allowing someone you cherish to face their darkness alone, is simply unthinkable. In your own life, in what you're building, you may recognize this dynamic. Perhaps you are the one receiving such support, the beneficiary of someone else's quiet devotion that makes your work possible. Or perhaps you are the one extending yourself, pouring energy into sustaining others even when your own reserves run low. Either way, Maria Celeste's story reminds us that the most profound connections often operate below the surface of public recognition. While history remembers Galileo's discoveries, it nearly forgot the woman whose love and practical assistance made many of those discoveries possible. Her letters, preserved by chance, reveal not just the depth of her devotion, but the sophistication of her understanding. She grasps the significance of her father's work not as an abstract intellectual exercise, but as something that touches the very foundations of how humans understand their place in creation. She sees both the beauty and the danger of such knowledge and chooses to stand with him regardless of the cost. As afternoon settles over the convent, Maria Celeste returns to her cell to write once more. The light slants through her window at the same angle it illuminated her morning prayers, but now it carries the weight of another day spent in service to something larger than herself. Her quill moves across the parchment with practiced grace, carrying words that will travel the short distance to her father's villa like small boats crossing a vast sea. "I pray," she writes, "that you find in these simple words some echo of the love that surrounds you. Even in your solitude, even in your confinement, the truth you have glimpsed among the stars shines no less brightly for being temporarily obscured." And in this exchange of letters, this bridge of words spanning the gap between enforced isolation and chosen seclusion, something essential continues to flow. Not just information or comfort, but the fundamental human recognition that no one, no matter how brilliant or how burdened, was meant to carry the weight of truth entirely alone. Cloud darkness descends, the onset of blindness, but as the seasons turned at Arcetri, as 1636 gave way to 1637 and beyond, another kind of darkness began to gather around Galileo. Not the metaphorical darkness of censure or the spiritual darkness of doubt, but something far more immediate, far more personal. His eyes, those remarkable instruments that had first peered through a telescope and seen what no human had seen before, began to fail him. Perhaps you know something of this particular weight, not the dramatic collapse that makes headlines, but the gradual erosion, the slow recognition that something fundamental is slipping away. The morning when you realize that the page you're reading seems somehow dimmer, the evening when the candle flame appears softer at its edges, less defined. For a man who had built his understanding of the universe on observation, this was not merely inconvenience. It was catastrophe approaching on silent feet. At first, Galileo attributed the changes to fatigue, the strain of his trial, the endless hours bent over manuscripts in inadequate light, the weight of confinement pressing down upon him. Surely rest would restore what seemed temporarily diminished. Surely the sharpness would return, but the human body, like the celestial bodies he had studied, follows laws that cannot be negotiated with, cannot be argued into submission. The deterioration was gradual, then sudden, like so many of the changes that reshape our lives. The way a business partnership slowly fractures until one morning it's simply over. The way trust erodes grain by grain until the foundation can no longer hold. The way our own strength seems constant until the day we discover it is not. By 1637, Galileo was writing to his friend Elia Diodati. Alas, your dear friend and servant Galileo has been for the last month hopelessly blind, so that this heaven, this earth, this universe, which I, by my marvelous discoveries and clear demonstrations, had enlarged 100,000 times beyond the belief of the wise men of bygone ages, henceforward for me is shrunk into such a small space as is filled by my own bodily sensations. Listen to that phrase, shrunk into such a small space as is filled by my own bodily sensations. The man who had expanded humanity's vision of the cosmos now found his world contracting to the reach of his fingertips. The sound of footsteps in the corridor, the texture of paper beneath his palm, and yet there is something in his words that speaks not only of loss, but of a different kind of discovery beginning. You understand this, don't you? This moment when what you thought was your greatest strength, your sharpest tool, begins to desert you. When the skills that built what you're building start to feel uncertain in your hands. When the clarity you once relied upon becomes clouded. It's in these moments that we discover what lies beneath our most obvious capabilities. What remains when our familiar instruments fail us. For Galileo, the practical implications were immediate and humbling. The man who had once ground his own lenses, who had adjusted telescopes with the precision of a master craftsman, now struggled to navigate his own study. The manuscripts that had been his constant companions became barriers. The instruments that had revealed the heavens became mere shapes in an increasingly dim world. But perhaps most challenging of all, he had to learn to accept help. Enter Vincenzo Viviani, a young mathematician, barely 20 years old when he arrived at Arcetri in 1639. Sent by the Grand Duke to serve as Galileo's assistant, his eyes, his hands. What might have been merely a scholarly appointment became something far more intimate, far more essential. Viviani would later write of those days with a tenderness that speaks to something deeper than professional duty. He described how he would read aloud to Galileo for hours, not just scientific texts, but poetry, correspondence, even the mundane details of household accounts. How he learned to anticipate the old man's needs, to position papers just so, to guide his hand to the inkwell without making the assistants feel like diminishment. There is something profound in this image. The aging giant of science, his eyes clouded with cataracts, listening as a young man's voice brings the written world back to life. The student becoming the teacher's window. The teacher becoming the student of a different kind of attention. You know this dynamic, don't you? The moment when you realize that the success of what you're building no longer depends solely on your own capabilities. When you must learn to see through other eyes, to trust other hands, to let your vision be carried forward by voices younger and steadier than your own. It requires a particular kind of courage, this surrender of control, this admission that the weight you carry cannot be carried alone. But something remarkable began to happen in those dim months at Arcetri. As Galileo's physical sight diminished, as the familiar visual world receded, other faculties seemed to sharpen. Other ways of knowing began to emerge. He found himself listening more intently, not just to Viviani's reading, but to the sounds that had always surrounded him but had been overshadowed by the dominance of sight. The particular quality of footsteps that told him whether his visitor was hurried or at ease. The way the wind through the olive trees changed pitch as the seasons turned. The subtle variations in his daughter's voice that revealed her state of health, her state of mind. Even when her letters spoke only of cheerful topics. Touch, too, became a language he had never fully learned to speak. The grain of wood in his desk, the weight and balance of his pen, the texture of paper that told him whether a letter came from nearby Florence or distant France. His hands, which had once been merely tools for manipulation, became instruments of exploration, and in this forced slowing, this necessary attention to the immediate and the present, Galileo's mind began to work in new ways. The theoretical insights that had always been part of his genius now had space to flourish without the constant distraction of visual input, without the temptation to reach for the next book, the next instrument, the next observation. He began to dictate his thoughts with a fluency that surprised even him. The dialogues concerning two new sciences, his final great work, emerged not despite his blindness, but perhaps because of it. The forced stillness, the necessary dependence on memory and pure reasoning, created conditions for a different kind of breakthrough. It was as if the loss of one kind of sight had cleared space for another. The external eye had dimmed, but the inner eye, the eye that sees patterns and connections and possibilities, grew stronger. There's something here for you to consider as you lie in your own darkness tonight. Something about the relationship between limitation and liberation, between what we lose and what we find. You carry so much weight, bear so much responsibility for what you're building, and perhaps there are moments when you feel your own sharpest tools beginning to dull, when the skills that once came easily require more effort, when the clarity that once seemed automatic becomes something you must work to maintain. But consider Galileo in his darkened study, learning to see through Viviani's eyes while discovering new depths in his own inner vision. Consider how constraint can sometimes create rather than destroy, how limitation can force us to discover capabilities we never knew we possessed. The external circumstances of our lives, the things that happen to us rather than the things we choose, these are rarely what we would select for ourselves. Blindness, confinement, the gradual erosion of what we thought was our greatest strength. But within these unwelcome boundaries, if we can find the courage to explore rather than simply endure, new forms of insight become possible. In the evenings at Arcetri, when Viviani had finished his reading and the household had settled into quiet, Galileo would often sit in his chair by the window, not because he could see the view, but because he could feel the air moving differently there, could sense the vast space beyond the walls even without seeing it. And in those moments, in that particular quality of solitude that comes not from choosing to be alone, but from being forced into a new relationship with the world, he would think, not about what he had lost, but about what remained, not about the observations he could no longer make, but about the patterns he had already seen and what they might mean. The moons of Jupiter continued their dance, whether he could see them or not. The mathematical relationships that governed their movement remained constant. The truth he had glimpsed through his telescope, the truth that had brought him such trouble, continued to unfold in the darkness as surely as it had in the light. And perhaps this is what we learn from Galileo's blindness, that the deepest insights, the most essential truths about what we're building and why it matters, these don't depend on perfect conditions, don't require optimal circumstances or unlimited capability. They require instead the willingness to work with what we have, to find new ways of seeing when the old ways fail, to accept help when independence becomes impossible, to discover that the weight we carry, even when it includes unexpected burdens, can still be borne. Tonight, as you rest in your own darkness, as you let the day's accumulated weight settle into something more manageable, remember that sight takes many forms. That insight often emerges not from perfect vision, but from the willingness to explore what lies beyond the reach of our most obvious senses. What you're building, the vision you carry, these don't depend solely on your ability to see every detail clearly. They depend on your willingness to keep moving forward even when the path becomes dim, to trust in patterns you've already recognized even when you can't observe them directly, to let others become your eyes when necessary while never losing touch with your own inner sight. The darkness around you now is not your enemy. It is simply space, space for a different kind of attention, space for insights that only emerge when the constant input of daily urgency finally quiets. Whispers of rebellion, two new sciences. In this quieter space, something remarkable begins to take shape. Even as the Inquisition's watchful eyes remain fixed on Villa il Gioiello, even as his own eyes fail him completely, Galileo finds himself drawn to one final act of defiance. Not the bold public gestures of his younger years, but something more subtle, more enduring. The weight you carry tonight, it shares something with what he felt in those dim morning hours, dictating to young Vincenzo by candlelight. The pressure of knowing something important, something that could change how people understand their world, but being unable to share it freely. The frustration of having insights that must be carefully managed, strategically revealed, Two new sciences, he calls this work. The title itself is an act of quiet rebellion, not astronomy this time, not the dangerous territories that landed him in this predicament. Mathematics, physics, the science of motion and the strength of materials, subjects that seem, on their surface, safely removed from theological controversy. But you and I both know, there's no such thing as truly safe knowledge. Every genuine insight threatens someone's comfortable assumptions. Every breakthrough challenges some established way of doing things. Listen, can you hear it? The soft scratch of Vincenzo's pen across parchment as the old man's voice fills the study. No longer the confident pronouncements of the young professor who once dazzled Venice with his telescope. Something quieter now, more considered. The voice of someone who has learned the true cost of speaking truth to power. Consider a beam of wood, Galileo begins, his blind eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the window. Supported at both ends, loaded at its center. What determines when it will break? What governs the relationship between its length, its thickness, the weight it can bear? Simple questions, practical ones, the kind that builders and engineers might ask. Nothing here about the movement of planets or the structure of the cosmos. Nothing to alarm the senses. But Vincenzo understands, as perhaps you do too, that these seemingly innocent inquiries are laying groundwork for something much larger. A new way of thinking about the physical world. A method that relies not on ancient authorities, but on careful observation, mathematical analysis, direct experience. The very approach that got them into trouble, now disguised as engineering problems. The mornings pass this way. Dictation, revision, the slow accumulation of insights that feel, to both men, like acts of quiet revolution. But mornings are only part of the story. Because what good is revolutionary thinking if it remains locked away in a villa under house arrest? The real conspiracy begins in the afternoons. Picture them, these carefully orchestrated visits. Former students, now scattered across Europe, finding reasons to pass through Florence. Colleagues from the old days at the University of Padua, traveling on other business, but somehow discovering time for a brief social call. Publishers' representatives, merchants, diplomats, all with their own reasons for stopping by Villa Il Gioiello. The Inquisition's watchers note these visits, of course, but what can they say? An old blind man receiving friends, perfectly innocent, perfectly normal. What they cannot see are the whispered conversations in the garden, the careful exchanges in Galileo's study when Vincenzo steps out for wine, the way certain visitors leave with their traveling cases slightly heavier than when they arrived. You know this dance, don't you? The delicate choreography required when you're building something that challenges the established order. The way innovation so often requires creative approaches to sharing information. The networks of trust that must be carefully cultivated when the direct path is blocked. One particular afternoon in late 1636, a Dutch merchant named Louis Elzevir finds himself in Galileo's garden. Officially, he's there to pay his respects to the great philosopher. Personally, he's curious about some mathematical manuscripts he's heard might be available for publication. The conversation is careful. Coded, Galileo speaks of his work in theoretical terms. Abstract principles that might someday be of interest to scholars. Elzevir nods thoughtfully, mentioning that his publishing house in Leiden has recently expanded their catalogue of scientific works. There seems to be growing appetite, particularly in the Protestant territories, for new approaches to natural philosophy. Neither man speaks directly about smuggling banned manuscripts out of Catholic Italy. Neither acknowledges the risk they're both contemplating. But when Elzevir departs 3 days later, his traveling case contains something that was not there when he arrived. The weight of what you're building. It often requires this kind of patience, doesn't it? This willingness to work through intermediaries, to trust in networks you cannot fully control, to release your ideas into the world without knowing exactly how they'll be received or where they'll land. Back in the study, Galileo and Vincenzo continue their work, but there's a new quality to their collaboration now, a sense of urgency tempered by hope. They know their words will not die in this villa. Somehow, somewhere, the ideas taking shape in these quiet morning sessions will find their way to minds capable of building upon them. The resistance of a solid to breaking, Galileo continues, his voice stronger now. increases not in proportion to its thickness, but to the square of its thickness. A beam twice as thick can bear not twice the weight, but 4 times. Mathematical relationships, precise, testable, undeniable, the kind of knowledge that transforms how bridges are built, how ships are designed, how the physical world is understood and shaped. But more than that, a demonstration of method, a proof that the human mind, working carefully and systematically, can uncover the hidden patterns that govern reality. That authority based on tradition and assumption can be replaced by authority based on evidence and reason. Revolutionary ideas dressed as engineering problems. The irony is not lost on either of them. Here, in confinement, Galileo is producing perhaps his most subversive work, not because he's challenging religious doctrine directly, but because he's showing a path around it entirely. A way of investigating the world that makes ecclesiastical approval irrelevant. Winter deepens around the villa. The olive trees stand bare against the Tuscan hills. Inside, the conspiracy of knowledge continues. More visitors, more careful conversations, more manuscripts finding their way into the hands of sympathetic publishers beyond the reach of Roman censors. You understand this patience, don't you? This faith that good work, carefully done, will eventually find its audience. That the networks you're building, the relationships you're nurturing, the value you're creating, all of it will somehow connect with the people who need it most. Even when you can't see the complete path. Even when the immediate obstacles seem insurmountable. By spring of 1637, word begins to filter back through those same careful networks. The manuscript has reached Leiden safely. Elsevier's publishing house is preparing it for print. Soon, 2 new sciences will exist not as a hidden document in an Italian villa, but as a published work available to scholars across Europe. The relief Galileo feels is profound, not just because his ideas will survive, but because he has found a way to contribute meaningfully despite all the constraints placed upon him. The blindness, the house arrest, the constant surveillance. None of it could prevent this essential act of sharing knowledge. In your own work, building what you're building, carrying the weight you carry. Perhaps there's something here worth remembering. That influence rarely travels in straight lines. That the most important changes often happen through networks of relationship rather than grand public gestures. That sometimes the most powerful rebellion is simply continuing to do good work, continuing to seek truth, continuing to trust that somewhere, somehow, the value you're creating will find its way to the people who can use it. The old astronomer sits in his study as evening approaches, listening to Vincenzo read back the day's work. His physical eyes may be dark, but his mind remains luminous. Still curious, still building, still finding ways to push against the boundaries that others have tried to impose. The weight of his confinement has not broken him. It has refined him, concentrated his efforts, forced him to develop new forms of patience, new networks of collaboration, new ways of ensuring that important work continues even under the most difficult circumstances. Outside, the Tuscan countryside settles into dusk. Inside Villa Il Gioiello, an old man and his young assistant continue their quiet revolution. One insight at a time, one carefully shared manuscript at a time, one act of intellectual courage at a time. The darkness gathering around them is not their enemy. It is simply the backdrop against which their small light burns more brightly, the space in which their whispered rebellion takes root and begins to spread. Legacy in the stars, a peaceful passing. Time moves differently when you're carrying the weight of years, when the body begins its slow surrender while the mind remains as restless as ever. In these final months at Villa Il Gioiello, Galileo has learned to measure his days not by the sun he can no longer see, but by the rhythm of small rituals. The morning arrival of Vincenzo with his careful footsteps on the stone stairs, the afternoon letters that arrive less frequently now, the evening sounds of the Tuscan countryside settling into darkness. You know this feeling, don't you? The way time compresses when you're building something that matters. How the urgent deadlines and quarterly targets fade into background noise when you're focused on what will truly endure. Galileo, at 77, has found that peculiar peace that comes when you stop fighting the current and begin to trust the deeper flow. His hands shake more now as he dictates his thoughts to Vincenzo. The young man has become more than an assistant. He's become the keeper of conversations, the guardian of half-formed ideas that might otherwise vanish into the winter air. Together, they work on correspondence with scholars across Europe, men who still seek Galileo's insights on motion, on mathematics, on the fundamental questions that have driven his life's work. But it's not the grand theories that occupy him most in these quiet hours, it's the smaller mysteries. The way sound travels differently through his villa on humid mornings, the patterns he can trace in the textures of familiar objects, the mathematical relationships he discovers in the rhythm of his own breathing. When you can no longer see the stars, you begin to find entire universes in the space between heartbeats. Maria Celeste visits when she can, though her own health has grown fragile. The weight she's carried, supporting her father through his trials, his house arrest, his gradual decline, has taken its toll. But when she sits beside his chair in the study, reading aloud from letters or simply sharing the silence, there's a completeness to those moments that transcends the particular sorrows of their circumstances. She tells him about the garden at San Mateo, how the winter herbs are still growing despite the cold. She describes the way morning light falls across the convent's courtyard, painting shadows that shift like sundial markings throughout the day. Through her eyes, he continues to see. Through her careful observations, he remains connected to the world of visible things. "The stars are particularly bright tonight, Father," she might say, and he nods, remembering. Not just the stars themselves, but the first time he turned his telescope skyward. The shock of discovering that the moon had mountains, that Jupiter had companions, that the universe was so much vaster and more complex than anyone had dared to imagine. What you're building now, the weight you carry in your own sleepless hours, it's part of this same continuum, the same drive to look beyond the accepted boundaries, to ask questions that others find uncomfortable, to trust your observations even when they contradict the conventional wisdom. Galileo's revolution wasn't just about astronomy, it was about the courage to see clearly and speak truthfully about what you've seen. As winter deepens around Villa il Gioiello, Galileo's world grows smaller, but somehow more concentrated. The study where he spends most of his time has become a universe unto itself. Every book spine familiar to his fingertips. Every creak of the wooden floor mapped in his memory. Vincenzo reads to him from the latest letters from France, from England, from the German states. Reports of experiments inspired by his work. Observations that confirm or extend his theories about motion and mechanics. There's a particular satisfaction in learning that his ideas continue to spread, continue to inspire new questions in minds he'll never meet. The manuscript of 2 new sciences that they smuggled to Holland has found its way into the hands of natural philosophers across Europe. The seeds he planted in those careful pages are taking root in soil he'll never see. But perhaps more than the intellectual legacy, it's the method that matters. The patient observation, the willingness to question authority, the insistence that truth emerges from careful attention to how things actually behave, not how we think they should behave. This is what you carry forward in your own work. This commitment to seeing clearly, even when clarity is uncomfortable. The winter nights are long now, and Galileo often finds himself wakeful in the hours before dawn. Not with the anxious restlessness you might know, that 3 a.m. inventory of problems and pressures, but with a different kind of alertness, a listening quality, as if he's waiting for something, not a message or a revelation, but simply the next movement in a conversation that has been unfolding for decades. Vincenzo sleeps in a small room nearby, ready to assist if needed. But increasingly, Galileo treasures these solitary hours, the way his mind moves freely through the accumulated insights of a lifetime, connecting patterns that span decades, finding new relationships between ideas he first explored as a young professor in Padua. Sometimes he imagines he can feel the earth turning beneath him, not as a metaphor, but as a physical sensation. The great sphere rotating through space, carrying his villa, his country, his entire world through the cosmic dance he spent so many years trying to understand. There's comfort in this, in being part of something so much larger than the particular troubles of any individual life. The correspondence with scholars continues, though his responses grow shorter, more essential. He's learned to distill complex ideas into their most concentrated form, not because he lacks energy for elaboration, but because he's discovered the power of simplicity. The fundamental principles that govern motion, that describe the behavior of falling bodies, that explain the mathematics underlying natural phenomena. These can be expressed with elegant brevity when you've spent decades understanding their depths. Maria Celeste brings news from the outside world. Political changes, church developments, the ongoing wars that continue to reshape Europe. But these feel distant now, like weather patterns observed from a great height. What matters is closer, the quality of attention he can bring to each remaining day, the care with which Vincenzo transcribes his thoughts, the warmth of his daughter's hand when she sits beside him in the gathering dusk. As January turns toward February in this year of 1642, there's a settling quality to the days at Villa il Gioiello, not resignation, but a kind of completion. The major work is done, the essential insights preserved, the dangerous ideas safely transmitted to minds that will carry them forward. What remains is this: the simple presence of an old man who changed how humanity sees its place in the cosmos, spending his final days in the company of those who love him. The Tuscan countryside continues its ancient rhythms around the villa, olive groves standing patient in the winter air, distant hills holding their familiar silhouettes against the sky, the Arno flowing toward the sea with its cargo of mountain snowmelt and human history. Galileo has become part of this landscape now, no longer the restless investigator traveling between cities and courts, but a fixed point around which others orbit. Students, correspondents, family members drawn by the gravity of his accumulated wisdom. And in those final weeks, as his strength ebbs with the winter light, there's a particular peace that settles over the villa. Not the peace of surrender, but of work completed, of truth preserved, of love given and received without reservation. Maria Celeste reads to him from the Psalms, her voice carrying the same careful attention she once brought to copying his manuscripts. And Vincenzo continues to record his observations, his questions, his gentle corrections to letters from colleagues who still seek his guidance on matters of natural philosophy. The last conversations are about mathematics, about the beautiful simplicity of the laws that govern falling bodies, about the way geometric relationships reveal themselves in the physical world, about the profound order that underlies the apparent chaos of natural phenomena. Even as his body fails, his mind remains engaged with the fundamental questions that have driven his entire career. Still curious, still wondering, still finding new connections between ideas that have occupied him for decades. And when the end comes, on January 8, 1642, it comes quietly, like the completion of a long equation, like the final observation in a lifetime of careful looking. With Maria Celeste holding his hand and Vincenzo sitting nearby with his pen and paper, ready to record any final insights that might emerge from this most careful observer of the natural world. And outside, the Tuscan night holds its familiar constellations, the same stars that first called to him through his telescope, now bearing witness as their most devoted student completes his own orbit and settles into the deeper rhythm that connects all things, the mathematics of mortality that even the greatest minds must eventually solve, not with resistance or regret, but with the same patient attention he brought to every other mystery he encountered, trusting that the truth he discovered and preserved will continue to illuminate the darkness long after his own small light has joined the vast community of stars he spent his lifetime learning to see clearly.